Well, hello everyone and welcome back. My name is Emily Hough and I'm an EENA board member. I'm also editor-in-chief of the Crisis Response Journal. And I'm going to be chairing the next couple of sessions. We do have a slight change of program, unfortunately, in that Albert Mukhaiber cannot make it because he has COVID. But don't worry, we have a plan. So we're going to extend our discussions and Q&As with our first speaker, who is Eric McNulty. Now, Eric is a long-time friend of Crisis Response Journal, and he sits on our advisory panel. His main role, though, is Associate Director of the National Preparedness Leadership Initiative at Harvard University in the USA. Eric's also co-author of an excellent book, You're It, Crisis, Change, and How to Lead When It Matters the Most. Because in many ways, the last few years have re-emphasized the need for good leadership in a crisis. And I think both of the rather humbling presentations and discussions that we saw just now earlier on in the opening sessions have really emphasized this. And leadership isn't just expected from those who are in senior positions. I think at every point, at some point in their lives, everyone is going to be called upon to lead in some capacity or another. But what does it take to prepare for leadership in some of the most challenging crises of our times? Eric McNulty has some of the answers. Eric, could we have Eric's slides, please?
Thank you, Emily, and such a pleasure to be with you. Thank you all for getting together, and thank you for your work. My colleagues and I at the National Preparedness Leadership Initiative have been studying crises for about 20 years. And one of the things we have consistently found is that they're overmanaged and underled. And by that I mean we've been brilliant at advancing the protocols and procedures and advancing the technology of knowing what to do in the moment. We've been less good at understanding the human factors, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about this morning. But first, let me start with a story. It's May 22nd, 2011, a rather ordinary Sunday in the small city of Joplin, Missouri. The big news that day was that it was the high school or secondary school graduation. So many families were celebrating the accomplishments of their young people who were about to move on in life. Late that afternoon, the sky grew ominously dark, a gray-green that could only mean one thing. Soon thereafter, an EF5 tornado ripped through Joplin. It left a almost 10-kilometer-long swath of destruction. More than 150 people died. More than 1,000 were injured. 75% of the city saw some damage, and almost 25% of it was completely destroyed, including large parts of the central business district, schools, houses of worship. The heart was ripped out of that community that day. But several months later, not many at all, the schools reopened on time. Downtown was on a path to being rebuilt. There was energy and enthusiasm. People were positive about the future. And Joplin has come to stand for resilience in the U.S. Now, why did I fly all the way here to tell you about an incident that's more than a decade old, that involves a threat that you actually face much less frequently here in Europe than we do in the U.S.? It's because the story behind the story tells us a lot about what we need to know going forward as a profession and as communities to prepare ourselves for a turbulent future. When I dug into what happened in Joplin and began to understand, began to talk to people, I heard many stories. And along the way, someone mentioned a resilience plan. My eyes lit up. I said, I want to know more about that, because it had been sort of glossed over in the presentation I saw. And I did get to learn more about that. And it turned out the resilience plan was not about tornadoes. It was not about floods or blizzards or any of the other threats that we commonly talk about in places like this. It was about keeping their young people in school long enough that they would graduate from secondary school. Because it turned out that while once upon a time you could drop out of school and get a job at a factory in Joplin and earn a decent living, raise a family, that was less and less possible. And so the people in the city of Joplin realized that they needed to figure out a way to help their young people succeed educationally if the economy was going to continue to thrive. And so they convened a coalition of the willing. Wound up being more than 150 organizations and individuals who committed to helping solve this problem. They took a deep dive to understand what caused students to drop out of school. They looked at economic issues, they looked at educational challenges, they looked at addiction, they looked at domestic violence, all the possible causes. So they would really understand the problem. In public health, that's what we call a social determinants approach. And then they committed, as a community, that they would meet the needs of any student who was thinking of dropping out within 24 hours. And that could be anything from needing a pair of shoes, to needing a place to live, to needing addiction services or psychological counseling. Whatever it was, they would meet the needs within 24 hours. And they began to see improvement. Now, the connection between those two stories, the first I told you, and then the story behind the story, is that when the tornado hit in May of 2011, what allowed them to respond so well and so quickly and begin recovery on such a positive note was that they were able to flip what they had been doing around school dropouts to apply to the tornado. So let's take that apart a bit. What they built was adaptive capacity in the community. They opened people up to change, to saying, for the future, what we see coming at us, we are going to need to do things differently. Let's figure out how to do that. They took that deep dive to understand why, and they began to articulate what resilience would look like, what services people would need, what skills they would have to have, and how they as a community could come together to provide it. But most important, through that process and through working together, they built high degrees of trust. They connected people across sectors, across neighborhoods, from the more affluent parts of town to the poorer, the more challenged. They built this deep web of trust. And so when the tornado hit, they knew how to work together. They knew how to do things quickly, and not just with the formal response agencies, but with the businesses, with the various civil sector organizations, the nonprofits, the average people who wanted a role. That's what they had brought together, and that's what enabled them to move forward on such a positive path. That is what we are going to need today in every community. And as I look at this, the lessons I took when I first learned these stories were, one, they defined the problem as one the community actually saw, cared about, and would commit to helping solve. Unlike so many efforts we undertake to identify risks as emergency preparedness folks and try and get people to care about the risks we see. Now, our risk perceptions may be totally accurate, but we know how difficult it is to get people to care about the things we think they should care about. Instead, here, they tapped into something people did care about, and they used that as the way to build forward. They took that social determinants approach and didn't just look at the easy things you could look at in terms of education, but again, looked at all the different factors that could play in and committed to addressing all of those factors to move forward. So how do we use these lessons as we step forward and lead into the future? Well, I've got good news and I've got bad news. I'm going to start with the bad news. We'll get that over with. The number and scope of threats we are seeing is increasing. It's not going down. And I think we're in an environment that we simply can't respond our way out of, physically, economically, psychologically, As brave and committed as those who are responding to crises are, it's both unfair and unrealistic to put all of that onto their shoulders. We've got to do more. Now, why do I see this? And I've been looking at and forecasting a period of extended turbulence for a while now, because since 2008, I've been looking at 4 interconnected trends that I think are going to keep us in an unsettled state for at least the next few decades. The first of these is rapid urbanization. You think, what does that have to do with all of this? Half the world's population lives in urban areas, and by mid-century, it's going to be 75%. And that does not mean that Marseille or Berlin or Paris or London are going to double in size. A lot of that growth is in the developing world, in the global south. These are what I call cities of desire, growing through both aspiration and desperation. People looking for a better life, people who are challenged in their traditional ways of life. They're coming into cities, and these are collections of people without the usual infrastructure and governance mechanisms that we're used to in urban areas. Healthcare and public health, emergency services, the basic things that create order and help us work well with a dense population. These cities of desire are prime laboratories for infectious disease spread as well as conflict and unrest. Alongside that, we have an aging population in the global north. Japan's at the head of that, followed by Europe, then North America and China. In aggregate, our population's getting older, meaning they are more fragile, more vulnerable to floods and heat waves and other stresses. It's going to take more resources to take care of our population. They're going to be less able to help us along the way. So you've got an aging north, where you still have the greatest concentration of wealth, a rapidly growing global south, which is concentrating. It's a very combustible mix. Lay on top of that climate change. When I first started doing this work, very few people knew what IPCC stood for. Now we get reports on the climate almost daily. And the one thing we have seen that's consistent is that climate scientists have been too timid in their forecasts. These changes are happening faster and more severely than they predicted. This is going to increase severe weather. It's going to increase lots of threats we see, sea level rise, lots of challenges going forward, and these are challenges you can't just solve overnight. And then finally, we are ever more tightly connected through travel, trade, and technology, which is how a novel virus could emerge in Wuhan, China, a city whose name most of us didn't know 3 years ago, and engulf the world in pandemic. We're that tightly connected that it's the butterfly effect on steroids. One small thing in one part of the world can quickly ripple across the entire world. When you think about that social determinant approach I mentioned, this is what you need to look at. There's insecurity growing across a whole range of things, from health to the economy to housing and so on. We've got to be thinking about this because this is a real laboratory for challenges, for crises to emerge. And when you look at how people are feeling about the future, this is data from a World Economic Forum study that's looking at the next 3 years. And you don't really need to worry about the details here so much as 3 of the 4 slices of this pie are negative. Consistently volatile, fractured trajectories, progressive tipping points with catastrophic consequences. Only that little yellow slice is positive. People are seeing this coming. That's actually the transition from the bad news to the good news, which is the challenge of getting people to care about the things you need them to care about is going to get a bit easier. It's popping up more on their radar. Here again from the World Economic Forum, these are the top perceived global risks over the next 10 years. All of those in green are environmental. The red ones are about social cohesion. And then you've got a little bit here about debt and financial concerns, and then the yellow is global geopolitical conflict. And this was done before the current rise in inflation, before the conflict in Ukraine, so the data might be a bit different than it was when this survey was taken. But still, You can see what's popping up on people's radar, what they're concerned about, are now more likely to be the same kind of things you worry about. And so beginning to take that approach of having them care is going to get a bit easier. Doesn't mean the challenges are going to be any easier, but getting them to care will be. And so as we think about leading in this environment of persistent turbulence, of a time when we have more fragile populations here in our communities in Europe, when you've got more threats, when you've got potential unrest coming from around the world, what are we going to do? We call it forming the swarm, which is a phenomenon we first noticed in the response to the Boston Marathon bombings back in 2013, where we saw a highly cooperative leadership response across the government agencies, but as well as the affected businesses, the communities involved, the nonprofit sector. People worked really, really well together in a way we had not seen before. And in trying to explain that, I dove a bit into biology and looked at how do non-human species achieve high degrees of cooperation, bees and termites and ants. How do they get these sophisticated outcomes when they don't have procedures and protocols, when they don't have chains of command, when they don't have operation centers and command centers? Well, it turns out what they do have are simple rules and behavioral cues. And we went back through our notes about the marathon bombings, and we found 5 very specific behavioral patterns that helped explain cooperation. We looked at Joplin. We saw it there as well. And several other incidents we went back and looked at and found these very similar patterns. And now we have seen some agencies, some organizations actually prospectively trying to determine or define different behavioral norms that they can use in a crisis situation to increase cooperation, to increase collaboration, to get people to work better together when it matters most. So here they are. The first of these is a commitment to trust-based relationships. They spend time investing in relationships, getting to know people, coming to events like this, but also the trainings, the exercises, not doing it just in their silo, but being broader about that. So in Boston, we have 3 major events a year that are planned disasters. New Year's Eve, which we call First Night, the marathon, which just occurred, happens every April, and then our 4th of July, our Independence Day celebration. So while people are working to make sure those events are safe and secure on the surface, behind the scenes, they're actually running scenarios, getting people used to working in a multi-agency environment, testing new protocols, equipment, et cetera. And so what happened in 2013, that response that went so well, had been rehearsed 2 years prior in a very similar scenario. It had been more than a decade of investing in those relationships to be able to work together. So there was not suspicion. There was not the usual elbow throwing that we can get in a major incident. The second of these, really hard for humans, is no ego, no blame. It's people in a community, people in a response realizing you're going to either succeed or fail together. It isn't my agency, it isn't my team that can do well while everybody else does poorly. We've actually got to pull things together. That again, that builds on the trust. It builds on investing and training people to know how to resolve conflict, how to find common ground with people they may otherwise disagree with or be very different from. It's investing in those human factors, again, so you see success as common and the potential failure as common. The third one is you've got to be good at what you do. Proficiency in your domain of expertise, what you're responsible for. I know you are all highly competent. We need to make sure people realize how competent you are and have, again, that trust in each other, that we trust fire services, medical, police to do their jobs, and the other players in the system, that we can count on them when we need them most. When you are good at what you do, it allows you to then be generous in reaching across when asked or when needed across those lane boundaries. People helping each other, people jumping in and say, what do you need? How can I help? We've seen this over and over in the most successful responses to major incidents. It's not jumping over and trying to do someone's job, but it's being there when you need them, being able to offer the extra resources you may have or the experience and expertise that someone else may be lacking, but that ability to work well together. When you get the first four right, you can then get to unity of mission. And people are really coming behind a common cause, be it to save lives, be it to rebuild our community, be it to address the rising challenges of climate change, be it to make the investments in the services needed that may not be so obvious to support the people in our community, to help them come together. In a world where there are too many gaps and too many chasms between parts of our communities, it's about building bridges between them. And so we see a common future and we see a way forward. And as I say, we have seen organizations now setting these behavioral norms or ones very similar to them. So in addition to the great technology, in addition to the well-rehearsed and well-thought-through protocols, and the checklist you may have, we're actually thinking about how are we going to behave. And in the research we have done with the people who've come through our executive education programs around leadership, we've asked them within an ICS or another highly structured response environment, have you seen leader behaviors that have improved or degraded team performance? And it was an overwhelming yes in both cases. And it is people who are able to regulate emotions, to keep their egos in check, who are able to communicate clearly, who are able to articulate a clear path forward, and who are worthy of trust, who optimize our performance in a highly structured as well as in a non-structured environment. Behavior matters. That's why leadership matters. And so as you're thinking forward and taking the lessons from this EENA conference and other events and other work you're doing, remember, the end of the day, our threats may change, our capabilities may evolve with them. We as people don't change that quickly. And we've got to attend to those human needs, to take care of each other, to be unified in facing these threats. If we do that, I'm confident we'll be up for the job. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Eric. I think the one thing I've taken away from this is, in some ways, leadership is all about humanity. It is about trust. It is about no ego, and it is about unity. Why don't you take a seat, and we'll have a little chat, and we'll ask some. We'll have a discussion about this, and then we'll take some questions from the floor if there are any. Where to begin? I think the first question I'd like to address is, resilience is a term that gets used a lot, and perhaps it's even overused. How can leaders make the concept more tangible and useful?
It's a really great question, and thank you for asking that. I've seen resilience used a lot already, and we were only in the first half day of this conference. What I have discovered when I've been looking at it, and I've been looking at resilience for quite a number of years now, is that if I come here and talk about resilience, I hear a lot of talk about networks and equipment and infrastructure, which is very important. If I were to go down the road to Nice to a psychology conference, I'd hear a lot about resilience there as well, and I wouldn't hear a thing about networks or equipment or infrastructure. It would all be about psychology. And if I were then to continue up to Lyon and go to a conference of environmental scientists, I would hear yet a different definition of resilience. It'd be around evolution and changing form to preserve function. For making it real and tangible, we need to draw upon all three of those areas of expertise. And what I would encourage people is to be thinking through and articulating as tangibly as you can what resilience actually looks like. What does resilience mean? So if for the Palais de Congrès here in Marseille, one of the definitions of resilience is that we're never without power for more than 15 minutes. Perfectly legitimate. What has to be true for that to actually happen? What's the training? What's the staffing? What's the equipment, et cetera, et cetera? The more precisely you can articulate it in your exact setting, the better you'll know what to do in order to make it emerge.
And of course, then you have to start looking at your interactions within other organizations and communities and societies and so forth. And that leads us on very, very neatly to another area that I'd like to get your thoughts on. How formal emergency management entities work best with informal responders. And for those of you who I hope all of you saw the presentation on Beirut, we saw that volunteers are, members of the public are always first on the scene. How can we establish a relationship of trust and leadership between these emergency management organizations and responders, volunteers, sorry?
What you say is so true. It is always the true first responders are those who are closest to the scene, not the first professional responders, but the first there in trying to help. And even not beyond those first moments, the people who may be able to, who know the community, can work in the community, help people come out and begin to help themselves, are an important part of the response effort. And so I think we, first of all, need to begin to invite them in and not pretend they are some other entity. And I think we're getting much better at this, at least in the U.S., of recognizing this and seeing that we need to, again, build bridges between the formal and the informal. You can't live your world inside the emergency tape, the incident tape, and look at those who actually can bring new skills. I did back in Superstorm Sandy back in 2010. I deployed with FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. I deployed with their first ever innovation team. And that was only 2 people from FEMA, and then about 35 or 40 self-deployed people, technologists, designers, and others. And they did amazing things. And what they did was they looked for the gaps where between state, federal, and local officials where they hadn't been able to get to yet, or some needs they didn't know how to address. They were building mesh networks. They were doing other things rather quickly. And it worked best when they actually coordinated and didn't fight with each other, didn't ignore each other. They didn't trust each other initially very much, I will say that. But they built that trust by working in the field together. So I would say look at those people you expect to show up and think about how you can bring them in, as well as how you can go to them. I know one of the annual events we have in Boston, one of our big property owners, Boston Properties, owns actually the Prudential Center right by where the bombings happened, in the marathon bombings. Every year, they run an exercise and invite all the public sector agencies in. All the law enforcement, fire, EMS, as well as their tenants. They run a scenario. And the magic there, caffeine and carbohydrates. Get some good pastry, get some coffee. People will show up. Again, it helps build trust. But also, you learn some very valuable things about how people are thinking about response, what they're expecting of you, what you can expect of them. And very simple. Nobody pays to go to it. It's very low expenditure to host it. And that is part of how you begin to build the relationships and sort of, again, see it as an integrated response ecosystem and not separate components.
That's very interesting, because it comes back to, as you mentioned, expectations and what do communities expect from emergency responders. And that ties into what you said in your presentation about that we're facing a risk environment that is outpacing our ability to respond. So those expectations are going to have to be reevaluated, and in some ways that conversation has to begin. That, everyone is also engaged. Everyone is part of a community and a society, so we all have our bit to play. And I think in some places or some countries, and I'm talking from sort of my own experience, there's this expectation that if something happens, well, we'll just wait to be rescued. And that's not always going to be the case in some of the more cataclysmic events that we've been looking at, isn't it?
No, that's right. And I think it is a bit more of self-reliance, but to me it's also really community resilience because, and again, we fall prey to this in the States, of expecting every household to prepare individually. Now, we know from looking at major events that people respond as neighborhoods, they respond as communities, and so it's helping each other. So if everybody doesn't have quite enough food or enough water or enough bandages supplied, they will help each other. So I think it's a big way to connect, thinking better of how we connect those communities and get people to see themselves that way. I know I almost got laughed out of the White House many years ago now when they were asking how do we improve resilience. and I'm not sure what the equivalent is here in Europe, but we have something called a block party, which is where you close a bit of the street, you come out and you have some food, and you share some drink, and you have some music, and people have a party together. And I said, encourage that. Because when neighbors come out and meet each other, know each other, first of all, you learn some things like the elderly lady on the corner, you may need to be ready to help her because she can't do much on her own, but know what she needs and what she doesn't need. But also just getting to know each other, you'll be able to work together more quickly, more easily when when disaster happens. And I think part of that is basically, it's, as you said, a lot of this is basically human. Humans are social. It's building those basic social bonds so they're strong, and they'll be there when we need them most.
That's true, and the emergency services, especially in the local areas, could be the catalyst for that, couldn't they? I know that in the UK, during the first days of lockdown, neighbours that we'd never spoken to, I was WhatsApping them. I suddenly magically had their numbers, and we were sharing, you know, because there were food shortages in the shops. You know, we were providers of toilet roll. So, and it's sad though, because in some ways that's died down again. You know, people come together in a crisis, and then it sort of dissipates. But at least that bedrock is there, and people do want to help each other. We're going to turn to a lot of the articles that you've very kindly written for the Crisis Response Journal over the years and so forth. You discussed the idea of meta-leadership, and I wondered within this context if you could expand a little bit upon what is meta-leadership and how do we aim for it, and then that will take us into another question that I have about the programs that come out of it.
Okay, well, thank you. So meta-leadership, M-E-T-A, is the phrase we use, our framework for crisis leadership. And it's very simple. It's intentionally simple in its construction. There are three dimensions. There's the person, who are you, and there's a lot of the human elements we talked about, emotional intelligence. In a crisis, are you grounded and functioning well cognitively, so you're thinking clearly, psychologically, so your emotions are in check, so you can have confidence in yourself as a leader? Do you understand the situation? And I mean this beyond situational awareness. We have lots of great tools for knowing what's been deployed where, but can you see the deeper patterns? Do you understand the deeper implications and get to what we call situational insight, so you really deeply understand what's happening? And then building the connectivity. That's a lot of what I talked about here this morning. Not just leading down if you're the positional leader with a team who reports up to you, but how do you lead up to your boss? How do you lead up to an elected official? How do you lead up to those over whom you may have no authority? How do you lead across the various units within your agency and then beyond to the external stakeholders, the general public, the media, other parties who may be outside your normal day-to-day? And that's a lot by influence. That's a lot comes through your credibility, your reliability, your willingness to invest in relationships, and certainly your ability to be trustworthy, improve your trustworthiness. And so what we have found in teaching this, it helps people organize a lot of what they know, what they do. And we do add obviously some teaching there as well. But that simple three-dimensional reference point, if things aren't going well, is it me? Am I not functioning well? Am I sort of operating from what we call the emotional basement? Or are we not clear on what's actually happening? Is the situation the problem, or is the connectivity broken down? So it proves a good diagnostic. It's a great guide when you're going forward and building capability, and then in the middle of a crisis to be able, again, to fine-tune what you're doing and adapt to have the best possible response. Thank you.
Now, I understand in our conversations before this presentation, you highlighted the Stop the Bleed program that originated out of a meta-leadership program. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about that and update us on what's been happening.
Sure. So the great fun that the participants in one of our sort of flagship program get to do is they come to Harvard for a week and they go work on a group project for 6 months, team project with other people in the program, and then come back and report to us what they've done. And a number of interesting projects have emerged out of that. And one of the things, Stop the Bleed, the original, the very core of the idea came before outside of the MPLI, but then really catalyzed to become a national program in the U.S. and an international program, came out of the connections in the MPLI and our exec ed program. People meeting each other and believing in this idea that you can educate and equip the general public to be able to to stop intensive bleeding so you can save lives. And it's been great to see it go forward. The first installation of Stop the Bleed kits in a major airport, that was a specific MPLI project in the Charlottesville airport in North Carolina in the U.S. And then most recently, the Stop the Bleed team is taking this to Ukraine. And they've developed a new PSA, which is on YouTube. I can share the link with anybody who's interested. But they've both reshot it and to make sure it's contextually appropriate, had it translated into Ukrainian with subtitles, and are trying to push that out because, again, I mean, looking at the horrible conflict that's going on there, you can't always rely on the professional services to be there fast enough in order to save lives. And so really trying to be aggressive about getting the information out. And that's a sort of, again, very sort of concrete project we encourage to try and make a difference on the ground. So when you are leading, we talk about leading, you're actually getting change to happen. You're making things, putting new things in place that are making our communities safer and more secure.
Thank you very much, Eric. Are there any questions from the floor? We might have to turn the lights up to see if there's anyone who has a question, because lovely as you all are, I can't see you.
And while we're doing that, I'll make sure everyone knows how to get a hold of me. So
is there anyone who has any questions? Still can't see you very well. Right.
Yes,
Hello.
thank you. I'm Alberto Pasquini. I'm participating to a European research project, this Engage, that will be presented tomorrow. This European research project, one of the activities of the research project is to identify solutions that are method, tool, processes that can help in preparing and managing disasters. So while looking for those solutions that are typically put in place by first responder, we also realize that there are something that is we call the informal solution that are very close to the informal participation of volunteers and people that you mentioned. And but it's extremely difficult, of course, to list them because informal solutions are something that depends on the situation, that are strictly related, and sometimes are just creativity, results of creativity and ability of the people to understand the situation. So the question is, what, in your opinion, can facilitate the production, the uninformal solution? So by people, by volunteers, by citizens in general. So it's training, but training is related to specific situation, while informal solutions are usually, you have an enormous variety of situations in which informal solution can have a role. So training is probably situation awareness or what?
So it's a great question. Thank you, and thank you for your efforts to begin to capture some of this important knowledge. I think that capturing the stories is a big piece of this and making them available. And also looking for, at least I know what we found in the States, is that there are these informal groups that are groups or that are networks of people, particularly in the technology space, who will self-deploy or will get involved in disasters whenever they can. They know each other. They actually resist formal training in some ways, but that's another interesting dynamic to explore. But I think connecting those people together so it becomes more of a network makes it more visible. And you're right, a lot of it is very situationally specific, where it's knowing the community. But I think hearing the stories of when that worked and when we could rely on people who knew the community to help solve things and increase the knowledge among the formal responders that this resource is there. It may look different in different communities, but there are people there who know how to figure things out. There are people, there's that knowledge we call these unknown knowns. Things are known, you just don't know people know them. And that could be anything from where are the most fragile members of the community to how do you begin to build certain solutions. I know in the Sandy response, we drew upon folks from UNICEF who had done a lot of sanitation work outside of the U.S. in disaster zones, which was something we hadn't really had to worry about as much, but we really needed to then. And so pulling in that expertise. But I would love to see us create a more vibrant repository or a more accessible sort of database of these things so people can find each other and learn the stories.
Thank you. Are there any further questions? We've got time for one more.
Yes, a hand up there.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you for your time. I was wondering if you have any ideas on how to make people work together outside of the crisis before it happens, because we work with multi-disciplines, and sometimes it's difficult to get them to work together because of the ego. And I was wondering if you have any ideas how to manage that.
Yes, it is not easy, and egos and history sometimes get in the way. I think that, as I say, finding opportunities when you can begin to break down the barriers, and often that involves getting people together over some food and then to share some experiences. And then creating the opportunities where working together poses some benefits and doesn't threaten the ego so much as it helps people see they're valuable contributors around the community. It is something that has to be worked at. It doesn't happen automatically, and it doesn't happen always easily. However, I have found a greater realization from people as I travel around the world that so many of these incidents we face now are so complex that no single person and no single entity can actually solve it by themselves. And so it's a matter of propagating some of these ideas, and that's part of why when I go around and talk about leadership, I talk mostly about leading as a behavior and as an action, not as a position that you hold, which is different. You want to be a commander, that's great, but talking about leading as bringing people together and moving them forward. And when you find people do it, tell those stories and celebrate them. But again, the magic of gathering together around coffee and whatever your favorite pastry product is, and then having people work through scenarios. I just did one in Louisville, Kentucky over this past weekend, and people from very different backgrounds came together very quickly because they got involved in solving the problem and working it together. That could help to a certain extent, I think.
Thank you. I think we're going to have to end it there, but thank you so much, Eric. And I'd also like to say that Eric is here for the whole of the event, in and out. You can usually ask for him on the Crisis Response Journal stand, so we can always get a message to him. But I'd like to thank you very much, Eric McNulty.
Thank you. Thank you very much.